They laughed at the man on the ridge because they thought fear had built his cabin. The truth was far stranger. Long before the first snow fell, long before the wind changed its voice, Nolan Hayes already knew something the town did not. The mountain town of Red Pine, Montana, rested beneath the towering shadow of the northern peaks, a place where pickup trucks still rolled slowly down Main Street and neighbors waved from porches weathered by decades of winter. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and for nearly a year their favorite topic had been the man living alone above them on the ridge. Every morning when the mist lifted from the valley floor, people could see Nolan Hayes working beside a strange cabin perched high above town. At 40 years old, Nolan carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent much of his life solving problems before they became disasters. His broad shoulders moved with steady purpose. His dark brown hair, touched with silver near the temples, stirred gently in the mountain breeze. His face rarely revealed much emotion, but his gray-blue eyes missed very little. Beside him, almost every hour of every day stood Bear. The 6-year-old German shepherd seemed less like a pet and more like a partner. His black and tan coat gleamed beneath the mountain sun, and his amber eyes constantly scanned the forests, ridges, and distant sky. While other dogs chased squirrels or barked at passing trucks, Bear watched, always watched. From the town below, the cabin looked unusual. Its walls were thicker than normal. The windows were smaller. A heavy steel door guarded the entrance. Ventilation pipes stretched across the roofline. Under a covered section beside the structure sat enough split firewood to last several winters. People noticed every detail, and people talked. One chilly October afternoon, several ranchers gathered outside the diner, holding paper cups of coffee while staring toward the ridge. "There he goes again," one of them said. Far above, Nolan hauled another stack of lumber across the clearing. Bear walked silently beside him. "What's he building up there?" another rancher asked. "A fortress." Laughter spread through the group. "Maybe he thinks the world's ending." More laughter followed. The joke had become part of daily life in Red Pine. Down at Rick Dalton's bar, the teasing was even louder. Rick, a broad man with a booming voice and endless opinions, leaned against the counter that evening while customers filled the room. He pointed toward the dark silhouette of the ridge, visible through the front window. "You see that place?" he called out. "That cabin's got thicker walls than the county courthouse." Several people chuckled. Rick raised his glass. "I'm telling you right now, Nolan Hayes is building himself the most expensive panic room in Montana." The room erupted with laughter. Outside, however, the mountain wind had begun to change. High above town, Nolan stood on the cabin porch, watching distant clouds gather beyond the northern horizon. The air felt different, colder, sharper. Bear sat nearby, ears upright. For several minutes, neither moved. Then the German shepherd slowly rose to his feet, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the forests and mountains. The dog's posture stiffened, his ears angled forward. A low rumble formed deep in his chest. Not a bark, not a warning, something quieter, something older. Nolan followed Bear's stare toward the distant peaks, where a faint line of dark clouds had begun to form against the afternoon sky. He rested a hand gently on the dog's neck. "You feel it too, don't you, buddy?" Bear never looked away. Far below, laughter drifted from the town. Above them, the first cold gust swept across the ridge, carrying a scent that neither man nor dog would ignore. The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. Frost coated the tall grass around the cabin, sparkling beneath the pale light of dawn. Nolan stepped onto the porch, holding a steaming mug of coffee, while Bear sat motionless beside the railing. Usually, the dog greeted every morning by patrolling the clearing. Today, he did not move. He simply stared north. Nolan followed his gaze. The distant mountains stood silent beneath a layer of thin clouds. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance, yet something about the air felt wrong. The wind carried a dry edge that did not belong this early in the season. "I know," Nolan said quietly. "I do not like it either." Bear's ears twitched, but he kept watching the horizon. Throughout the morning, Nolan worked on the cabin. He checked the ventilation system, inspected the wood stove, and reinforced a storage rack inside the supply room. Every movement followed a routine he had repeated dozens of times before. Yet his attention kept drifting outside. By noon, the temperature had dropped nearly 10 degrees. The shift was subtle, but enough to make Nolan pause. He glanced toward a small weather station mounted beside the porch. The pressure reading had fallen again. "That is faster than it should be," he muttered. Bear suddenly stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. His nose lifted into the breeze. For several seconds he remained perfectly still. Then he released a low whine. Nolan frowned. "What do you hear?" The dog turned his head slightly, listening to something beyond human senses. Later that afternoon, Nolan drove into town for supplies. Red Pine carried on as usual. Trucks rolled through Main Street. Children rode bicycles near the park. The smell of grilled burgers drifted from the diner. It looked like any ordinary fall day. Inside the grocery store, Martha Collins smiled as Nolan loaded canned goods onto the counter. "Stocking up again?" she asked. Nolan nodded. "Just being prepared." Martha chuckled. "Prepared for what?" Before he could answer, a familiar voice echoed from the entrance, probably preparing for an alien invasion. Several customers laughed as Rick Dalton walked inside. The bar owner grinned as he approached. "Tell me, Nolan, how many years can you survive up there now?" Nolan calmly handed Martha a $20 bill. "Hopefully I will never need to find out." Rick laughed louder. "You know, most people buy a cabin to relax. You built a fortress." A few people joined the laughter. Nolan simply collected his groceries. Bear remained seated beside him, watching silently. As Nolan headed for the door, Martha lowered her voice. "You really think something is coming?" Nolan paused. For a moment, he considered giving the honest answer. Instead, he smiled faintly. "I think mountains have a way of reminding people not to get too comfortable." Outside, the afternoon sky had grown darker. As Nolan loaded supplies into the truck, Bear suddenly froze. His ears snapped forward. Across the street, a flock of birds exploded from a stand of pine trees. Hundreds of wings filled the air at once. The birds circled briefly before heading south, fast, much faster than normal migration patterns. Nolan watched them disappear beyond the valley. Even Bear followed them with uneasy eyes. That evening, after returning to the ridge, Nolan stood beside the porch as the sun vanished behind the peaks. The wind had strengthened. It whispered through the trees with a restless sound. Bear paced the edge of the clearing for nearly an hour before finally stopping. He stared toward the northern mountains once more. Then, for the first time in months, he refused his dinner and walked to the porch steps instead. There he remained, alert and silent. Nolan looked toward the dark horizon. Far away, barely visible against the fading sky, a long line of clouds stretched from one end of the mountains to the other. And above them, a lone hawk glided south as fast as its wings could carry it. The wind arrived before sunrise and never seemed to stop. It rattled the cabin walls with long, restless sighs and swept across the ridge in cold bursts that bent the tops of the pine trees. Nolan woke before dawn and found Bear already standing beside the front window. The German shepherd had not touched his food during the night. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. "You have not slept much either, have you?" Nolan asked. Bear glanced back briefly before returning his attention outside. Nolan poured coffee and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit him immediately. Not normal autumn cold. This felt different, sharper, the kind of cold that usually arrived weeks later. He looked toward the distant mountains. The clouds had thickened overnight. A heavy gray ceiling now covered much of the northern horizon. Around mid-morning, Nolan drove into town again. This time he stopped at the small municipal office, where weather reports were posted for local ranchers and hunters. Martha Collins stood near the bulletin board, studying a forecast map. "You came to look too?" she asked. Nolan nodded. Martha pointed toward the chart. "The forecast says light snow possible by the weekend." Nolan studied the map quietly. Something about it bothered him. The numbers did not match what he was seeing on the mountain. "Forecasts are not always right," he said. Martha smiled nervously. "That sounds reassuring." Before Nolan could answer, the front door swung open. Rick Dalton entered carrying a newspaper beneath his arm. "There he is," Rick announced, "the king of the mountain." Several people laughed. Rick walked over and glanced at the weather chart. "Let me guess. You are here to warn us about the end of civilization again." Nolan remained calm. "I am saying the weather feels wrong." Rick folded his arms. "Feels wrong? Pressure is dropping too fast. You got a degree in weather now?" More laughter echoed through the room. Nolan simply shrugged. "You do not need a degree to notice when something changes." Rick grinned. "Well, when your secret mountain bunker saves humanity, I will buy you dinner." Martha shook her head. "Rick!" "What?" he said with a laugh. "I am just having fun." Nolan turned toward the door. "I hope I am wrong." That answer seemed to catch everyone off guard. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside, Bear waited beside the truck. As Nolan approached, the dog immediately moved toward him. "Ready to go home?" Nolan asked. Bear did not climb into the truck. Instead, he stared across town toward the northern sky. His ears flattened slightly. Then he released a low, uneasy whine. Nolan followed his gaze. Even from town, the clouds looked darker now. On the drive back to the ridge, something unusual happened. Along the highway, dozens of deer emerged from the forests and moved south. Not one or two, entire groups. Nolan slowed the truck. Bear stood with his front paws against the passenger window, watching them pass. "That is not normal," Nolan said quietly. By evening, the wind had strengthened again. Tree branches swayed constantly. The temperature continued falling. Inside the cabin, Nolan checked every supply one more time. Firewood, water, fuel, medical kits, everything was ready. Bear paced from room to room before finally stopping near the steel door. He sat facing it as though waiting for someone. The hours passed. Darkness settled over the ridge. Then, just before midnight, Nolan stepped outside one final time. The valley below had disappeared beneath a blanket of strange fog. Lights from town glowed faintly through the haze. Above them, the sky looked heavier than ever. As Nolan watched, a sudden gust tore across the mountain. Far off in the darkness came the sound of hundreds of birds lifting into the night at once. Bear rushed onto the porch beside him. Every muscle in the dog stiffened. Neither of them moved. Somewhere beyond those mountains, something was coming. Morning arrived beneath an eerie calm. After 3 days of restless wind, the silence felt almost unnatural. Nolan stepped onto the porch and immediately noticed it. The trees were still. The air was heavy. Even the usual chatter of birds was gone. Bear stood beside him, staring toward the valley below. His ears remained upright, his body tense. "Too quiet," Nolan said softly. The German shepherd glanced at him but did not move. Down in Red Pine, life continued, as if nothing had changed. The diner opened before sunrise. The gas station welcomed its first customers. Children boarded school buses. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys across town. From a distance, everything looked peaceful, yet Nolan could not shake the feeling growing in his chest. Around noon, he drove into town once more. Several residents waved as he passed. Others nodded politely. Even those who laughed at him seemed relaxed beneath the clear sky. At the diner, Martha Collins carried a tray of coffee to a corner booth where Nolan sat looking through weather reports on his phone. "You still worried?" she asked. Nolan glanced through the window. "More than yesterday." Martha frowned. "But look outside. It is beautiful." Before Nolan could answer, Rick Dalton entered carrying a plate stacked with pie. "There he is again," Rick announced loudly. "Montana's most nervous homeowner." A few customers chuckled. Rick pulled out a chair and sat across from Nolan without invitation. "Let me guess," he said. "Today the sky is too blue." Nolan met his eyes calmly. "Sometimes the worst weather arrives after the calm." Rick laughed and pointed outside. "I see sunshine. I see pressure falling." "You always see problems." Martha rolled her eyes. "Rick, leave him alone." Rick grinned. "I am just saying, if a blizzard was coming, we would know." Nolan looked toward the mountains visible beyond town. Their peaks had vanished behind a distant white haze. Not always. The conversation ended there. Nolan finished his coffee and headed back toward the ridge. As he drove, Bear suddenly lifted his head. The dog pressed closer to the passenger window. A few miles ahead, something unusual appeared along the roadside. Ranch horses stood gathered against their fences, all facing south. None of them grazed. None moved. They simply stood together, watching the horizon. Nolan slowed the truck. "You see that?" Bear gave a low whine. The feeling returned immediately. That quiet pressure, that invisible warning. Back at the cabin, Nolan spent the afternoon making final preparations. He filled water containers, stacked additional firewood beside the stove, checked batteries, lanterns, blankets, and emergency supplies. Every task followed a checklist he had memorized long ago. Outside, Bear refused to leave the porch. Hour after hour, he sat facing north. Then, just before sunset, the dog stood abruptly, his ears locked forward. A deep growl rumbled through his chest. Nolan stepped outside. The sky above the valley remained clear, glowing gold beneath the setting sun. But beyond the mountains, something enormous had appeared. Stretching from one horizon to the other was a towering wall of white clouds. It looked less like weather and more like a moving mountain. Nolan stared at it for several long seconds. Beside him, Bear did not blink. The wind returned a moment later, colder than before, carrying the scent of snow. And far below, Red Pine continued, enjoying what would become its last quiet evening. The storm arrived before dawn. Nolan knew the moment it crossed the mountains, because the cabin itself seemed to notice. A deep moan rolled through the wind vents, and the steel door trembled faintly against its frame. Bear was already awake. The German shepherd stood at the front window, staring into a darkness filled with swirling white. Nolan pulled on his jacket and stepped onto the porch. Snow blasted across the ridge so fiercely he could barely see 20 feet ahead. The world beyond the clearing had vanished. "There you are," he murmured into the wind. Bear pressed against his leg and growled softly. By 7 o'clock, the power lines feeding Red Pine disappeared beneath thick layers of ice and snow. Down in town, people woke to a very different morning than the one they had expected. The diner remained closed. The gas station lights were dark. Cell phone service flickered in and out. Snow continued falling harder with every passing hour. Inside Rick Dalton's bar, Several residents gathered around the windows watching the storm intensify. "This is getting ridiculous," one rancher muttered. Rick forced a laugh. "It will blow over." Another gust slammed against the building, the windows rattled. Nobody laughed this time. Across town, Martha Collins stood inside the grocery store, staring at empty roads. Visibility had fallen to almost nothing. She tried calling neighboring towns, but every line failed. Her stomach tightened. The weather report from yesterday suddenly felt very far away. Back on the ridge, Nolan moved calmly through the cabin. He checked the stove, adjusted air circulation vents, and topped off water reserves. Bear followed closely beside him. Then the dog froze. His ears lifted. Nolan immediately noticed. "What is it?" Bear hurried toward the front door. Nolan opened it. Through the roaring snow came a faint sound. A vehicle engine. Struggling. Distant. Then silence. Nolan looked toward the valley. He could not see the road anymore. He could barely see the trees. The storm had swallowed everything. Hours passed. Snow accumulated faster than anyone in Red Pine could remember. By early afternoon, several feet covered the roads. Vehicles became trapped. Driveways vanished. The town's single highway disappeared beneath drifting snow. Inside the bar, concern replaced confidence. One man checked his phone repeatedly. No signal. Another shook his head. "The highway patrol is not answering." Rick stared through the white wall outside. His expression had changed. "How bad can this get?" Nobody answered. Then an older rancher quietly spoke. "My grandfather used to talk about storms like this." The room turned toward him. "What did he say?" Rick asked. The old man swallowed. "He said when the mountains decide to close the door, you stop being in charge." Silence followed. Meanwhile, on the ridge, Bear remained beside the window. The dog watched the storm with unwavering focus. Nolan stood next to him. Far below, hidden somewhere beneath the swirling snow, sat an entire town slowly realizing it had underestimated the mountain. Then Bear suddenly barked. Once, sharp, urgent, Nolan stepped closer to the glass. Through a brief opening in the snow, he caught sight of something that made his pulse quicken. The only road leading out of Red Pine had completely disappeared beneath a massive white drift. The town was cut off. The realization settled over Red Pine slowly at first and then all at once. By late afternoon, emergency generators had failed across parts of town. Snowdrifts buried parked vehicles. Front doors disappeared behind walls of white. The storm showed no sign of weakening. Inside the cabin, Nolan studied a hand-drawn map spread across the kitchen table. Bear stood beside him, watching the front door. Then came the sound. 3 sharp barks. The signal was immediate and urgent. Nolan looked up. "You hear something?" Bear rushed toward the door. Nolan opened it, and a blast of snow swept inside. Through the roar of the storm came a faint noise. Not wind, not trees. A horn, somewhere down the mountain. Nolan grabbed his heavy coat and emergency pack. "All right, buddy, let us go find them." Within minutes, man and dog disappeared into the storm. Visibility had dropped to less than 30 feet. Snow whipped through the air in thick curtains. Nolan moved carefully, following Bear's lead. The German shepherd seemed to navigate by instinct alone. Twice Nolan lost sight of him, only to see the dog emerge from the white haze a few yards ahead. Nearly half a mile down the slope, Bear suddenly stopped. His ears stood tall. Then he lunged left. Nolan followed. Buried beside a stand of pines, sat a pickup truck nearly hidden beneath drifting snow. The engine was silent. One headlight still glowed faintly through the accumulation. Nolan hurried forward and knocked against the window. A frightened face appeared inside. "Nolan?" the driver shouted through the glass. It was Tom Hensley, one of the ranchers who had laughed outside the diner only days earlier. Beside him sat his wife and young daughter wrapped in blankets. Nolan opened the door. "Can you drive?" Tom shook his head. "The wheels are buried. We have been stuck for 2 hours." Bear barked once. The little girl reached out and touched the dog's fur. "He found us?" she asked. Nolan smiled. "Yes, he did." Tom looked toward the storm. "We were trying to get to my brother's place." Nolan glanced at the darkening sky. "That is not happening today. Then what do we do?" Nolan pointed uphill. "You come with us." The climb back to the cabin was slow and difficult. Bear stayed beside the child the entire way, never wandering more than a few feet from her. By the time they reached the ridge, fresh snow had already covered their tracks. Inside the cabin, warmth greeted them immediately. Tom stared around the room in disbelief. The stove burned steadily. Lights glowed from battery-powered lanterns. Shelves overflowed with supplies. Water containers lined one wall. Blankets were stacked neatly near the fireplace. "Good Lord," Tom whispered. "You planned for this." Nolan removed his gloves. "I hoped I would never need to." Before anyone could say more, Bear suddenly lifted his head. The dog moved to the window, another bark, then another. Nolan followed his gaze toward the storm beyond the glass. Through a brief break in the swirling snow, He saw silhouettes moving on the mountain trail. More people were coming. By nightfall, the cabin no longer felt isolated. It felt like the center of a small surviving world. One group after another emerged from the storm, guided by instinct, luck, and sometimes by Bear himself. The German shepherd seemed to sense every arrival before anyone else. Each time he lifted his head and moved toward the door, another family appeared through the swirling snow minutes later. Nolan opened the door again and again, helping exhausted residents inside. Wet coats lined the walls, boots filled the entryway. Children sat wrapped in blankets near the stove. The scent of hot coffee and wood smoke spread through every room. Martha Collins stepped inside, carrying an elderly neighbor by the arm. Her cheeks were red from the cold. "I cannot believe this place is warm," she said. Nolan handed her a blanket. "Sit down, you are safe here." Martha looked around the cabin. "You planned for all of this." Nolan simply nodded and returned to helping others. Near the fireplace, Tom Hensley's daughter sat beside Bear, gently scratching behind his ears. "He is the reason we found this place," she said. Bear leaned against her leg and closed his eyes for the first time all day. More people arrived: ranchers, shop owners, mechanics, teachers. Nearly everyone who had once laughed at the cabin now sat inside it. The storm continued roaring outside, but within the steel walls there was warmth, light, and safety. Rick Dalton finally arrived shortly after midnight. Snow covered his coat. His face looked pale and exhausted. For several seconds he stood silently near the doorway, staring at everything around him. The supplies, the water containers, the emergency lights, the crowded room. Nolan approached him. "You made it." Rick slowly removed his gloves. "Barely." His voice lacked its usual confidence. "The power is gone everywhere." Nolan nodded. "I figured." Rick glanced around again. "How many people can this place hold?" "As many as it needs to." The answer lingered in the room. Several people exchanged quiet looks. A rancher sitting near the stove shook his head. "All those months." Rick looked at him. "What?" The rancher laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "We spent a year making jokes about this place." Martha smiled faintly. "Seems like the joke is on us." A few nervous chuckles followed. For the first time since the storm began, people relaxed. Children fell asleep beside the fireplace. Elderly couples rested beneath blankets. The tension that had gripped the town for days slowly eased. Rick remained standing near the center of the room. His eyes followed the thick walls, the reinforced windows, the careful organization of every supply. Finally, he looked directly at Nolan. "I need to ask you something." The room grew quieter. Even the conversations near the stove faded. Nolan met his gaze. "All right." Rick swallowed. For a moment he seemed unsure how to continue. Then he spoke the question everyone had been thinking. "How did you know?" The cabin fell completely silent. Outside, the storm hammered against the mountain. Inside, every eye turned toward Nolan Hayes. For several seconds, only the sound of the wind filled the cabin. The fire crackled softly. Snow tapped against the reinforced windows. Nolan looked around the room at the faces gathered there. Some were tired, some embarrassed, some simply relieved to be alive. Bear rested near the fireplace, though his amber eyes remained alert. Finally, Nolan spoke. "I did not know." Rick frowned. "Come on." Nolan shook his head. "I did not know exactly what was coming." Martha leaned forward. "Then why build all this?" Nolan stared into the flames for a moment. "Because I made a mistake once." The room grew even quieter. Several people exchanged curious glances. Nolan folded his hands. "Years ago, I was working in a mountain region overseas. We received warnings, small warnings, changes in weather, strange patterns, things people dismissed because life looked normal." He paused. Most people ignored them. No one interrupted. Then one storm arrived faster than anyone expected. Roads disappeared. Communications failed. Entire communities were trapped. Rick's expression softened. "You were there?" Nolan nodded. "I watched good people get caught unprepared, not because they were careless, because they believed they had more time." The words settled heavily over the room. Near the fireplace, Tom lowered his eyes. Martha quietly wrapped a blanket tighter around her shoulders. Nolan continued. "When I came home, I promised myself something. If I ever lived near mountains again, I would respect them." A rancher spoke from the corner. "So that is why you built this place." Nolan smiled faintly. "That is why I overbuilt everything." A few people laughed softly. This time the laughter carried warmth instead of mockery. Rick looked around the cabin. "You built it for a storm that might never come." Nolan nodded. "I hoped it never would." Across the room, Tom's daughter gently scratched behind Bear's ears, and Bear knew too. Several heads turned toward the German shepherd. Nolan glanced down at his companion. "Bear notices things before I do." Martha smiled. "That dog has been trying to tell us something for a week." The room chuckled. Bear lifted his head as if pleased by the attention. Outside, the storm continued to howl against the mountain, but inside the atmosphere had changed. The distance that once separated Nolan from the town seemed to disappear. No one saw him as the strange man on the ridge anymore. They saw the man who had opened his door. Rick stared into the fire for a long moment before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Rick let out a breath. "For being wrong," repeatedly. Laughter spread through the room again. Even Nolan smiled. "You are not the first." Rick shook his head. "No, but I might have been the loudest." The firelight flickered across the faces around the cabin. Families sat together. Neighbors shared coffee. Children slept peacefully beneath blankets. For the first time since the storm began, people felt safe. Then Bear suddenly lifted his head. Every ear in the room seemed to follow him. The German Shepherd walked to the window and looked outside. Nolan joined him. Beyond the glass, the snow still fell, but something had changed. Far above the mountains, a faint patch of stars had appeared through the clouds. The storm finally loosened its grip sometime before dawn. No one noticed the exact moment it happened. They simply woke to a different kind of silence. Nolan opened the cabin door just after sunrise. The world outside shimmered beneath fresh snow. Pine trees stood draped in white. The sky above the mountains glowed pale blue. For the first time in days, sunlight touched the ridge. Bear stepped outside first. The German Shepherd paused on the porch, lifted his nose into the crisp air, and then trotted forward with an energy he had not shown since before the storm. Behind them, people slowly emerged from the cabin. Martha shielded her eyes from the brightness. "I never thought sunshine could look so beautiful." Tom laughed softly. "I never thought I would be happy to see my truck buried." The mood felt lighter. Hope had returned. Throughout the morning, neighbors worked together, clearing paths and checking on homes. Nolan joined them without hesitation. So did Bear. Wherever the dog went, people smiled. Children followed him through the snow. Older residents scratched behind his ears. By afternoon, news finally reached Red Pine that road crews were making progress toward reopening access to the valley. Relief spread quickly through town, yet something else had changed as well. People no longer looked at Nolan with curiosity or suspicion. They looked at him with gratitude. 2 days later, the town gathered near the community center. The sky was clear. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys once again. Rick Dalton stood at the front holding a small wooden plaque. "I am not usually good at speeches," he admitted. Laughter rolled through the crowd. "That is true," someone called out. Even Rick laughed. Then his expression softened. "A few weeks ago, I thought Nolan Hayes was the strangest man in Montana." More laughter followed. Rick pointed toward Nolan. "Turns out he was the smartest." The crowd applauded. Nolan shook his head. "I do not know about that." "Too late," Martha said with a smile. The vote was unanimous. Rick held up the plaque. Carved into the wood were simple words: Red Pine Community Shelter. Beneath the name appeared another line: built by Nolan Hayes, protected by Bear. The crowd applauded again. Nolan accepted the plaque quietly. For a moment he seemed unsure what to say. Then he looked around at the people gathered there: the ranchers, the shop owners, the families, the neighbors who had weathered the storm together. "Thank you," he said simply. "But this place belongs to all of us now." A warm murmur passed through the crowd. Later that evening, Nolan sat on the cabin porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The valley below glowed gold beneath the fading light. Bear lay beside him, resting comfortably with his head on his paws. In the distance, laughter drifted up from town. Nolan smiled. "Looks like they are doing all right." Bear thumped his tail against the porch boards. The mountain stood quiet once more. Not defeated, not conquered, simply respected. And as the first stars appeared above the ridge, Nolan realized something important. He had built the cabin to prepare for a storm. What he found afterward was a home. Beside him, Bear lifted his head and looked toward the lights of Red Pine. For a long moment, man and dog watched the town together. Then the evening breeze moved gently through the pines, carrying with it the peaceful certainty that kindness, preparation, and quiet wisdom are rarely noticed at first. But when the hardest days arrive, they often become someone else's miracle. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.